Ischemic heart disease is the most common cause of death in high-income countries, and indeed globally is the cause of 7 million deaths per year. We estimated that a 30% cut in the consumption of animal source saturated fat would result in a substantial decrease in the order of about 17% in the number of premature deaths from heart disease among adults in the United Kingdom. That's equivalent to 18,000 premature deaths averted in 1 year, or about 3% of all deaths in the United Kingdom. So to summarize, we identified a strategy to meet greenhouse gas emission targets for the agriculture sector in the United Kingdom, which was namely to cut the production of livestock, and we estimated that if implementation of this strategy also led to a fall in the consumption of animal source saturated fat, it would have a substantial benefit to population health. This is a great news story, a policy that is good for the environment and good for public health, a rare win-win scenario in this area.
Out of these 14% greenhouse gas emissions coming from agriculture, fertilizers represent 38%, but livestock represents another 31%. And in the 2006 study called Livestock's Long Shadow, the study published by the FAO then, it was noted that in total, taking into account deforestation to create pastures, livestock is responsible for 18% of greenhouse gas emissions, almost double the share of transport. Together, grazing land and cropland, in order to produce feed crops, account for 70% of all agricultural land, or about 30% of the land surface of the planet. Livestock grazing alone is responsible for 26% of the use of ice-free terrestrial surface of the planet, and the rapid expansion of pastures is one of the major reasons for deforestation, particularly in the Amazon region. This, ladies and gentlemen, is not the best use of our scarce natural resources. What is, however, clear to me is that we cannot continue to define quantitative objectives in the production of food, such as, for example, the need to increase meat output by more than 200 million tons to reach 470 million tons by 2050, one objective identified in advance of the FAO World Summit on Food Security, without questioning trends on the demand side of the equation, particularly when epidemiologists constantly warn us of the public health problems resulting from the meatification of diets.
Oui, les deux premières, oui. Non, pas les autres. Non, pas les autres, les deux premières.
I personally believe that the problem of climate change has now reached proportions that we cannot possibly ignore any longer. And therefore, if we continue with this intensification of production of meat, then clearly we are going to add to the problem of water scarcity and water stress. And this should be seen in light of the fact that there's a large number of people across the world who are malnourished, who don't get enough food, but much of the food grain that's being produced today is going into production of meat and products of the livestock cycle. If, for instance, that was not to be, then a good proportion of this would perhaps add to food security worldwide, and people would be able to get much better nourishment. 1/3 of the world's cereals harvest and over 90% of soya protein is used to feed animals. Now that's a substantial quantity. And this is essentially going to animals, not humans. Despite the inherent inefficiencies of meat production, And let me also tell you that it takes more than 10 kilograms of animal feed, and this is essentially food grains, to produce 1 kilogram of beef. If you look at the comparison with soy alternatives, a tofu burger is responsible for 10 times less CO2 emissions than a comparable beef meat product. And I think, therefore, we must realize we are all residents of spaceship Earth. And if we want to protect the climate of this Earth and stabilize temperature increase to, say, 2 degrees Celsius or less, then I think we have to use every means to mitigate the emissions of greenhouse gases. And I'd submit to you once again that cutting down on meat consumption would be an extremely effective way of doing so. Thank you very much.
What can the European Parliament do, and the governments of the world? I suggest that they could encourage and guide people to reduce meat consumption. It's no longer a personal choice. This is something that's going to affect the whole of the planet. So what I'm here today to suggest is that the first step is a meat-free Monday or a meat-free day, which allows people to get into this idea simply. It's also not a new idea. This kind of thing has occurred in the past. President Truman in 1947, in his first televised address to the American people, talked about the crisis in Europe and how the American people were going to have to help people after the war, and they needed to provide aid in the form of food. He suggested in 1947 that they should not eat meat on a Tuesday, and he went further. He suggested that on Thursday they should not eat poultry and eggs. And this was something that actually happened. You know, we forget that this has been done in history. I think we also have to look at world poverty, where you've got 1.4 billion people in extreme poverty. So this has become an urgent social issue. And one of the best things we can do, I believe, is to just reduce meat consumption. So, in summing up, I urge you, each of you, to do your bit for your people, for their children, and for the planet they will inherit. Go meat-free one day. Thank you.
So we three urge MEPs to respond to the expert opinions expressed here and encourage them to show a lead by consuming less meat. We call on these governments, and all represented at Copenhagen and in subsequent discussions, to adjust their agriculture, development, environment and public health policies to reflect the role of livestock production in climate change. We call on the local authorities and municipalities in Europe and worldwide to adopt the principle of a meat-free day for their employees. And we call on people worldwide, but especially in the developed nations, to change their diet to one meat-free day as the most effective way to combat global warming.